Well, good day to you. It is December the 19th, 2020, and I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Now, if this is your first time ever listening to Search for Signs, thank you and welcome to Search for Signs. We have over 300 videos where we talk about the emergence of Maitreya and the Masters of Wisdom. Through the course of these videos, we take a deeper look at who and what Maitreya is, and we also discuss why are the Masters returning now to the everyday world after hundreds of thousands of years being away from the public. And what does it mean for all of us, especially you? And then we tie it into the many miracle signs that are going on in all walks of life and all faiths. People of no faith even are having miracle signs, crosses of light, crop circles, UFO sightings, weeping icons, visitations are being saved by angels and so forth. And what does it mean? Does it mean that the teacher who made a promise to return at some point, and he made that promise to every religious group, the 5 religious groups around the world, the Christians, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and the Jews are all waiting for a teacher to come back at some point. They all have different interpretations of what that means, how the teacher is going to come back, but a promise was made to each of them. And not just to them, but to the whole world. But does it mean that the teacher for the world, Maitreya, is already here and slipped into London in 1977 without any fanfare and without any recognition, and has been living in a modern city ever since? And even, and listen to this very carefully, has been speaking on TV unrecognized as the one awaited by all the world's religions, and has been speaking on TV to millions of people for a decade now. Does it mean that or not? That's what we discuss on this channel. So to me, it's the most important thing that we could be talking about. But, anyway. And I also, of course, present this information for all of us to consider, and it's not anything that you have to believe or anything like this. In fact, it's not important that you believe what I believe about Maitreya. The most important thing to take from these videos is the priorities of Maitreya. Maitreya says, really, peace is essential. We have to create peace. Our very future depends on it. Now, the path to peace that Maitreya has presented to humanity is quite simple. You would think it would be very complex, but it's actually very simple. He puts it like this: without sharing, there could be no justice. Without justice, there could be no peace. Without peace, there could be no future for humanity. So, taking a look at this real quick, the most important part of that puzzle is the principle of sharing, because it's the first thing that we need to look at. If you are an American, for instance, your knee-jerk reaction to that statement would be, well, shoot, that's communism or that's socialism. I hate that. That's evil. Well, I beg to differ with that. But the principle of sharing is actually not communism, and it's not socialism. I need to be very clear on that. It's really, if you look at how a family relates to spreading the resources that a family gets on a daily basis to the people of the family, it's the same principle, because from the master's point of view, which is the truth of the matter, humanity is one family, and the resources of this planet belong to everyone, not just to those ambitious sorts that have hoarded it and are using it to profit, for their own profit and everything like this. Now, you would also say that it's rather utopian to think that they would give up that power. But once humanity starts to wake up to the fact that it is their resources and it belongs to everybody, and it's our very survival depends on the sharing, well, then it's going to be harder and harder for those people to keep those resources for themselves. But let me take a look at it like this. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example, because this is a really good model of the principle of sharing. It was done decades ago, right after World War II. The United States saw the need to help Europe. Now, Europe right after World War II was decimated. Cities were leveled, their infrastructure totally destroyed, people were suffering, people were out of work, so forth. What the United States did, under the inspiration of the then Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, instead of just giving them money or asking the people of the United States to give money to individuals in Europe, they took an inventory of what it wasn't using as a nation. Corn, building products, clothing products, steel, those kind of things, concrete, copper, whatever it happened to be, made an inventory of it and gave just the excesses that they weren't using for that year to Europe to use to help rebuild their countries. Once Europe got back on their feet, they were able to give back the excesses that they were starting to get back as payment. So it boosted the economy of the United States. So there was actually that boom that happened right in the 50s economically, right? Unquestioned, it was one of the golden ages economically for the United States right after this happened. Now, here's also what I want you to take from this, because this is where the peace part comes into play and the need for the principle of sharing comes into play. The long-term effect of a regionally practiced principle of sharing between the United States and Western Europe, the long-term effect that's been felt over the decades is we have a more peaceful and trusting relationships with those nations of Western Europe than we do with any other nations on the planet. Nations that we didn't trust prior to World War II as much. So if we just did this globally, nations would start to trust one another, and then we can face the biggest problems that we have that we can solve. If we all just work together, we could solve it rather easily. But we have to trust one another. That's why Maitreya says, without sharing, there could be no justice. Without justice, there could be no peace. Without peace, there could be no future. Peace is crucial. We must have peace, even if we want to solve the environmental problem. So let's talk about it in some different videos. But here's the thing. In this particular video, I have a special guest. His name is Gerard Aartsen. He's an international author, and after listening to him speak, if you're interested in his books, the link to get his books are in the descriptions. You can also, he said, go to Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, and purchase his books that way if you'd like. Now, I thought I was describing him correctly by calling him an expert on Space Brothers and UFO activity. He quickly corrected me and said he's not an expert, but he has but I will put it to you like this. I still consider him an expert. But anyway, he has a wealth of knowledge about this information. He's been studying it, he's been looking at it, and his perspective on UFO activity and Space Brothers is spot on, as they say in England. So he's actually from the Netherlands, but I'll use the word spot on. I don't know how they say it in the Netherlands. But anyway, without further ado, I want to bring on Gerard Aartsen, and I hope you enjoy the interview.
My new friend, Gerard Aartsen from the Netherlands, who I invited to come and talk on Search for Signs about his information, to share his information about the Space Brothers, tie it into what we know about Maitreya and the Masters of Wisdom and so forth. So, Gerard, welcome, and thank you so much for your time. You're very generous.
Thank you, Gary, for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Awesome. Now, you are a international author, and you have a new book out, Pioneers of Oneness. Perhaps you could start off by telling us a little bit about your new book, and then we can kind of get into it from there. How about that?
Yes, my new book came out in October, actually late October this year, and I was inspired to write it because of George Adamski's book by almost the same title, Pioneers of Space. Pioneers of Space was written and published in 1949 in a very small circulation print run. I think it was only 350 or 400 copies that were printed. And he presented a story of visiting and meeting people on the Moon, Venus, and Mars in that book as a matter of fiction. And when it was found that certain passages in that book were very similar to passages in his later book, Inside the Spaceships, which he claimed was a factual account of meeting people from other planets, the general consensus became that all his work was based on science fiction. It was all a figment of his imagination. But in my new book, I show that I present information that shows that both books are actually based on facts and his actual trips in space, one in spaceships and one in consciousness, and it's based on the latest science, consciousness studies, and the idea of oneness speaks so strongly from his book Pioneers of Space and that is what inspired me to write Pioneers of Oneness.
Oh, cool. Now, let me ask you this. Let's start back from the beginning. How long have you been interested in extraterrestrials? When did this whole interest start with you?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested. I've especially when I became acquainted with Benjamin Creme's books. Benjamin Creme wrote about the space brothers, people from other planets, Venus, Mars, especially on the first page of his very first book, and it's always been a topic of interest to me. But my deeper interest arose when I, as a collector and student of the Ageless Wisdom teaching and collector of the books that are published in that tradition, have been published in that tradition since Madame Blavatsky's work in the late 19th century. When I came across a book which at that time was considered George Adamski's first book, Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East, that presented to me a direct connection between the Ageless Wisdom teaching and the contactees. I had read George Adamski's books sometime during my life. I don't remember exactly when for the first time, but when I saw that he had written a book in 1936 called Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East, that's when my interest peaked, and I started to take a much closer look at especially his books, and later on also the books written by other contactees of the 1950s.
Interesting. Now, so you've had, quite a long history of interest in the stars and people from stars and other planets and so forth. Now, did you ever look at information coming from people other than George Adamski and Benjamin Creme in terms of coming up with your view on whether these are space brothers, or are they aliens, or are they extraterrestrials? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, did you ever look at it from other people's, because there's so many views on extraterrestrials, right? I personally am like you. I find that what George Adamski and Benjamin Creme talked about, I find a lot of truth in that, but obviously a lot of people have different views on it. Did you ever study anybody else's view, and maybe even if I'm sure most of them are quite different than George Adamski, but did you find anybody else that had similar experiences with these space brothers?
Definitely. First of all, when I started to study George Adamski's books, and I became acquainted with the notion of the contactees of the 1950s. I began to read some of those, their publications, to see if they had similar experiences, or if they were contrasting Adamski's, contradicting Adamski's claims and experiences. Because, like you said, nowadays there seems to be massive confusion about the true nature of the visitors from space. Some people are entirely convinced that there are only aliens with evil intentions here to plunder our planet, or to subjugate humanity into some kind of serfdom, and others who only believe in a galactic federation of lovey-dovey space visitors. So when you go back to the original accounts of people who claim to have met space visitors, and they all started around the same time in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and that's certainly when the first accounts became public. You see, the greatest possible correspondence in their accounts. They all talk about, well, not all, but a couple of them talk about people visiting from Venus and Mars. Others, whose accounts were published a bit later, and saw how the original, those who came out first, were ridiculed by science and others about their claims of life coming from Venus and Mars. They chose to veil, to hide the true origin of their contacts, and chose to use more fanciful names for the planets of origin. But the nature of the people that they claim they have met and their message, the central message, is all the same. And it's significant that they all were all asked to tell the people of Earth that we need to cooperate on an international level to avoid nuclear destruction, nuclear annihilation. And of course, this was happening in the midst of the Cold War, when America and its allies and the Soviet Union and their allies were pitted against each other in this war of ideologies between the freedom of the West and the justice of the Eastern Bloc, which, of course, when you think about it, cannot exist without each other. Justice doesn't exist without freedom, as freedom doesn't exist without justice. So, in order to maintain public support or not lose public support for their massive investments in nuclear weapons and conventional weapons at that time of the Cold War, the governments and the military started to spread doubt and confusion through misinformation, cover-ups first, and then misinformation and disinformation, deliberate disinformation about the purpose and the nature of these visitors. And I believe that shows how consistent the message of the original contactees was, and also how important it was, because their books and their talks drew a lot of public interest. And mind you, they were not only from the United States. There were others in Brazil and Italy, and one in France that I recently became acquainted with, in England. So it was happening all over the world, of course, with a focus on the U.S., because the U.S. at the time was the most powerful nation in the world, and the only one of two with a nuclear arsenal, and the only one open to the rest of the world. The Soviet Union was rather closed off. Mm-hmm. So I believe that all these things together show that there was a deliberate attempt to inform humanity about life on other planets, and their efforts to assist us in making it through this perilous time of transition between two ages.
Now, you talked about ideology. Where do the Space Brothers exist in terms of the way that they see life spiritually? Maybe God, for instance. The one question I do want to ask, and I would love to have your answer of it. There was a person who asked a question on Search for Signs a couple of videos ago, talking about the religious view, the fundamentalist religious view of UFOs is not extraterrestrials, but fallen angels coming from heaven and so forth. And I mentioned to him that I would, if I remembered, I would ask you, the expert on Space Brothers, to help answer that question as well. So the first question would be, what are the views? What are the spiritual, or what's the spiritual view of the Space Brothers about God and creation, maybe, and us in relation to that? And then how does that relate to maybe a fundamentalist religious view of Space Brothers or UFOs not being real but fallen angels, for instance?
Well, before I answer these questions, let's set the record straight. I'm not an expert on the Space Brothers, but I did study their attempts to contact humanity, perhaps with a bit more effort than most people who dismiss the account. And based on my studies and research, I can say that the spiritual views of life of the Space Brothers is entirely in line with and in sync with the spiritual view of the Masters of Wisdom on our planet. many of the visitors from space are equally advanced beings from other planets. Several planets that send their visitors here are rather more evolved than the planet Earth is. So the people from those planets would naturally be more advanced than the average human being. And so their view of life is very spiritual in the sense that they live by the love of God, which they see as an energy that pervades the whole of creation, and they experience life as literally one. They know that they cannot hurt anyone without hurting themselves, and so they live by the same precepts as we find in the teachings of Jesus, for instance, the teachings of Buddha. And there's no difference. The only difference is that they live by those precepts, by those teachings, which have come to us as well as they've been coming to them on their planet. And having lived by those teachings, they have they've advanced far beyond our present state of affairs on this planet. Does that answer the first part of the first question?
Absolutely. That's why that's why I consider you an expert. I'm kidding. No. Go ahead. I'm sorry. But yes, I see where you're coming from.
And the second question about the fundamentalist position regarding aliens. Well, I'm certainly not an expert on the fundamentalist, tenets and precepts or what have you. The idea of fallen angels, according to the wisdom teachings, is quite different. Fallen angels in the wisdom tradition refers to the beings that allow that. This is quite technical. In fact, human beings are threefold. The thing that we call me and that we see in the mirror is just a personality that is made up of a physical body, an emotional body, and a mental body, which, when they become coordinated, become a coordinated personality. And once there is a certain level of coordination between those three bodies of expression, it becomes accessible to the soul, which is the real human being. The soul exists on its own plane, the soul plane, and there it has its own soul body. And the fallen angels give us that causal body. So it's quite different from aliens. Although when asked, Benjamin Creme has confirmed that several of the instances in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where there are descriptions of angels from heaven, some of these were, or many of these were actually manifestations of one or more masters of wisdom or some of the space brothers. So, that's about how much I know about it.
Well, I thought I would ask. I don't think there's any truth to the fact that space brothers are evil aliens, or as much as I don't think there's any truth to the fact that they're fallen angels, that kind of thing. But I told him I mentioned to him on the video that I would ask you, so I did. But I appreciate your time with that. Now the other thing,
and of course, people shouldn't think that I'm convinced that there are only beneficent space people. There are other planets which are not as far evolved as our Earth. The Earth, according to the teachings, the wisdom teachings, is only halfway its evolutionary cycle. Evolution takes place, and it's really evolution of consciousness that the teachings talk about, rather than the evolution of the form, which is only in service to the evolution of consciousness. everything that evolves according to a plan, a grand plan of the logos, whether it's the planetary logos or our local God, so to speak, the embodying, the ensouling entity of our planet, or the solar logos. So our planet is halfway along that that journey that takes billions of years. And likewise, our planets that are ahead of us or not as far as us yet. And so the beings from those planets are, what we might consider evil or maleficent, except according to the information coming from Benjamin Creme, they, in many cases, have not lost their sense of oneness as humanity has. We at the moment are living as if we are all separate units, and we, of course, we are separate units, but we lost that sense of interconnection and responsibility towards each other, that sense of godhood. And even on the planets in our solar system that are not as far evolved as Earth is, they have not lost that sense of oneness. So even if their intentions of coming to Earth, as apparently they have been able until quite recently, were to for their own benefit, it was for the benefit of the whole of their people or their planet, and not just for a small group of privileged beings from their planet to enrich themselves even further. As some of our, business people are trying to do at the moment with probes to Mars or plans for colonies on Mars.
Interesting. I guess the next question would be, have you ever seen a UFO in person?
I have seen a UFO, although at the time I wouldn't have called it a UFO, and I didn't call it a UFO at the time. It didn't look like, it certainly didn't look like a flying saucer, and like anything metallic. But when I was as a backpacker, I loved going to Nepal in my early 20s, and I went there several times during the winter months. Would be at home in Holland, working to earn money for my next trip. And I usually end up in Nepal for a good couple of months, usually in the same place. Beautiful place at the foothills of the Himalayas, with a beautiful green lake. And one morning I got out of my room in the lodge where I used to stay, and I was looking up at the sky, and somehow, it was very early in the morning, so it was possible to just look at the sun as this copper disc. And this was the one time I went there with a friend of mine. I persuaded a friend of mine to join me, and we were there together. And I told him, "Hey, look up there. What is that actually happening? What I'm seeing now?" And what I was seeing was, there was a second copper disk moving away from the sun much faster than the sun travels across the sky. And it was just, identical and moving away, but faster, until at one point it just disappeared. And my friend said, "Don't ever point things like that out to me again, because it freaked him out." And that tells me that, I did actually see it. And later on, at the time, I didn't even think of a UFO or a spaceship or anything like that, because I hadn't started my studies yet, really. I did read a lot of Eric von Däniken books, Chariots of the Gods, etc. At one point, I even traveled around. It was my first trip to India overland with an actual backpack. And I think I was carrying around 6 or 7 of his books in pocket edition in my backpack. But at the time when it happened, I think it was 1980, I didn't think of it as a spaceship. But Later on, I asked Benjamin Creme, and I said, well, it wasn't a UFO, and Benjamin Creme said, well, wasn't it? Then I realized that what I saw was actually quite spectacular. And interestingly, much later, there were reports in the news from Taiwan where there were actually photographs of a very similar event, where two suns had been photographed quite rather next to each other. And that happened once or twice. So it's something that more people have seen.
Interesting. Now, when you do your research online, looking at videos, for instance, on YouTube of UFOs, is there any YouTube channel that you refer yourself to for your own research to help, because they're authentic, I guess is my point. Or does that make sense? My question.
How would I know that they're authentic? I don't have a hotline with the Space Brothers. Hey guys, I just saw this. What about it? Where are they from? No, in fact, I don't look. I don't do much research on YouTube at all. I read a lot, and okay. My research is not about UFO sightings, because UFO sightings happen all over the world all the time, every day. I'm not interested in UFO sightings. Why? What would it tell me? I can't tell, from my desk, from my computer screen, whether something is an actual UFO or a drone or something else. In many cases, I have my own suspicions. But what and this is the big mistake I think that most people make when it comes to UFO research, and what I write about in my in the first chapter of my new book. It's not about the sightings; it's about the reason why they're here. And George Adamski even said that several times. If people would only listen and take in the message that these visitors from space have been trying to give us through not just Adamski himself, but so many other people through the decades, and it has continued. In the 80s, there were several very significant and interesting cases of contact. One in Italy, one in Mexico, several others. They've never given up trying, except several sections of humanity have certainly upped their efforts to ridicule and make those people's claims look doubtful. But the message remains consistent. We have to cooperate. We have to look at each other as brothers and sisters in order to survive on this planet. And the longer we go on ignoring that message, the clearer, the more urgent it becomes. So my research is really looking for accounts of people who, from all kinds of different fields, who had the same kind of experience. In 2015, I put out a video compilation as a promo for my second book. And it has clips of people like Christian Yunzinov, who was the president of the World Chess Federation, and he was also at one point for quite a long time president of the Russian Federation state of Kalmykia. And he said he had been invited on board a UFO. Where he said the people are very much the same as us, and they wanted they get the same kind of message. Others from rather respectable sections of society have had very similar experiences. Even one of the popes, Pope John XXIII, in 1961, a well-known episode, encounter that was later shared with the world through the Pope's personal secretary. So when you put all these things together, some military, some government officials, some religious leaders, and you add it up to the accounts of the contactees, not from California or the US only, but from many different countries, then a more complete picture emerges about the significance and the urgency of their message and the reality and the nature of their being, but also their message to planet Earth.
Okay.
So it's not about the sightings; it's about why are they here? Why are they here now?
Good point. Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Because I'm, a lot of the people that I talk to about UFOs, obviously that's, the main point of the conversation is the sightings, right? It's the same thing with Maitreya and the Masters. Why are they here now? Nobody really asked that question. Why? What is it that they're here to teach us, at this time? What's crucial? Why is Maitreya on TV speaking in incognito right now? But people always get caught up in, why haven't I recognized him? Why hasn't very many people been talking about him on TV? That kind of thing. Why isn't there more about it?
Why didn't he appear to me?
Say again?
Why didn't he appear to me?
Exactly.
That's what you hear people ask.
Yeah.
It's not about that.
Yeah, that's true. So how long have you, well, let me ask you this question too. So did you study more George Adamski first, and then you started getting into reading Benjamin Creme, or was it vice versa? Or how did you? It will lead me to my next question based on how you answer that question.
What do you want to ask, or what do you want me to answer now?
Sorry. Did you start reading George Adamski's books first, and then started reading Benjamin Creme, or was it vice versa?
No, I actually started with Benjamin Creme's work. Okay. I read the first interview with Benjamin Creme in 1978, the first interview he did outside the UK. And I became involved immediately with spreading the information here. And it was only when I came across that booklet I mentioned, The Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East by George Adamski, 1936.
Okay.
When I came across that booklet, and I managed to obtain a copy, and I read it, I thought, wait, this is the Age of Wisdom teaching, but in a nutshell. And it's from George Adamski from 1936. How is this possible? And when I started to dig, I found out that he had been trained in Tibet as a child, in fact. So this was, in the early noughties, so maybe 2006, 2007, and I wrote my first article in 2008.
I see.
And from there I started to look up other contactees, and that's my first book I wrote about George Adamski, and it was published in 2010. And soon I found so much more information that was very much in line with his accounts, and that led to my second book, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, thank you. Yeah. Are you still there? It sounded kind of quiet.
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you this other question too. Do you think that the Space Brothers being here now has anything to do with what Benjamin Creme was talking about in terms of helping to clean up the atmosphere to keep our Earth safe until we learn to not destroy our environment?
Well, that's I think subsidiary to their original intention of helping to build a spiritual platform for the return of the teacher for the New Age. Mm-hmm. it's only because humanity has persisted in ignoring the warnings from the space visitors and many of our own scientists against the use of nuclear fission technology, which was necessary to defeat the Axis powers in the Second World War. But in the 1950s, I understand from Benjamin Creme, from George Adamski, and several others, the Space Brothers had offered the major powers on Earth an alternative source of energy if they would give up nuclear fission technology and would work together for the benefit of the planet. This offer was refused, and so humanity continued through our leaders, military, etc., to develop nuclear weapons, nuclear power stations, etc., etc. And the release of the radiation and the nuclear pollution made it necessary for the Space Brothers to help in keeping our planet habitable by neutralizing the radiation, harmful radiation, which our scientists mostly are not even able to measure and recognize, because it takes place, according to Benjamin Creme, on the etheric physical planes of matter, which are above the three planes of matter that we know and are familiar with: the dense physical and the liquid and gaseous physical. And that is what they have been doing in service to our planet, to keep planet Earth habitable. And according to Benjamin Creme, if it weren't for their service, we would be suffering endlessly now, physically, if the Space Brothers had not kept our the radiation levels within certain limits.
We owe them a debt, that is for sure.
I'm sorry?
Well, I said we owe them a debt.
Yes, we owe them a debt. Yes, absolutely.
Well, Gerard, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, in my latest book, Pioneers of Oneness, this actually started when I found an earlier book by George Adamski than Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. It turned out that he had actually written the very first book he wrote was called The Invisible Ocean, and in it he describes life as an ocean of consciousness. And again, very much in line with the Age of Wisdom teachings, and that helped me to venture into consciousness research and systems science, which now in the 21st century are looking at life and reality in very much the same terms. Sometimes, identical words even. And in my latest book, I bring together, in support of the claims of the contactees, and my claims that the stories of the contactees are, the presence of the space visitors here on Earth is in direct relationship with Benjamin Creme's claims about the emergence of the teacher for the new age and the return of the Masters of Wisdom to the everyday world. I bring in the latest insights from science to that actually support in very substantial and significant areas these claims from the contactees, from Benjamin Creme, from the wisdom teachings. So it's my research is broadening, but the evidence is becoming more and more solid.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess the next question I would ask, and then I would love to bring you back on and talk more about your books and how it relates to and how it's different than other books that are published on UFOs and extraterrestrials, if you're willing to do that. But I have one more question to ask you, and this is perhaps the most important question I can ask you. how do we get a hold of your books?
And my books are available in several languages, in fact, from all the online vendors like Barnes and Noble, Amazon, any bookshop with an online presence. And even if you just look up the titles of my books, I have a website. I don't sell my books on my website, but they are listed there with all the different language editions. If you look up the title and the ISBN, most bookshops will also be willing to just order them because they're available through international distribution.
Well, that is awesome. Well, I am definitely going to get a copy of that for Christmas, Pioneers of Oneness. And Gerard, you are very, very generous with your time, and thank you so much. And I hope everybody else enjoyed listening to what you had to say about the Space Brothers and George Adamski and tying it into this story as much as I did. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. You take care.
Thank you.
And as always, take action. Help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos. Have a great day.